You think you know what reality is made of: matter, energy, particles, space, time, maybe fields. If you've gone a little further, you imagine the universe as something built out of ingredients, like a recipe. Combine the right pieces and you get everything that exists. That idea feels solid. It is also the first thing physics quietly dismantles, because the moment you ask what those building blocks actually are, the picture you were taught starts to blur. Not because we don't know enough yet, but because the question itself is already leaning on assumptions that reality does not use. You were taught that the universe is made of things, little pieces that sit in space, persist through time, and interact. Atoms were once the answer, then smaller atoms, then particles. Each time it felt like we were getting closer to the real stuff underneath. Physics does not describe progress that way. Every time we thought we had found the thing reality is made of, it turned out not to be a thing at all. Atoms dissolved into electrons and nuclei. Nuclei dissolved into quarks and gluons. Particles dissolved into excitations of fields, and fields themselves stopped looking like substances and started looking like rules. This pattern is not accidental. It is the universe telling you that made of is the wrong question. Take a particle. You probably imagine it as a tiny object with properties: mass, charge, spin, location. But you never observe any of those directly. You infer them from interactions. A particle is not something you see. It is something you reconstruct from what happens when systems interact. A track in a detector, a flash of light, a transfer of momentum. The particle is the name you give to a stable pattern in those interactions. There is no extra bead hiding behind the pattern. That already breaks the everyday idea of building blocks. Because building blocks are supposed to be things you stack. Patterns are not stacked. They persist. Now look at fields, which are often presented as the deeper layer. An electron field, a quark field, a Higgs field. It sounds like we've found the substance of reality at last. But fields are not stuff either. A field is a mathematical assignment. It tells you what values are allowed at each event in space-time. It constrains what can happen when interactions occur. You never observe a field directly. You observe what it permits and what it forbids. Once again, reality refuses to give you a solid ingredient. This is where the illusion starts to crack. The universe does not seem to be made of objects or substances. It seems to be made of constraints. Laws that limit behavior, symmetries that restrict change, relationships that must hold no matter how you describe them. This is deeply counterintuitive, because you were taught to think that existence comes first and laws describe it afterward. Physics suggests the opposite. The laws are primary. What you call things are patterns that obey them. Now bring space and time into this picture, because they are usually treated as the stage on which the building blocks sit. Space feels like the container of reality. Time feels like the process that lets reality change. But physics does not treat either as a background. Space bends. Time dilates. Distances depend on motion. Durations depend on gravity. Space and time respond to energy and momentum. They are not passive. They are part of the same system. Gravity is not something acting inside space. It is the geometry of space-time itself. That alone should make you suspicious of the idea that space is something reality is built inside of. Once space and time become dynamic, the idea of fundamental building blocks becomes even harder to maintain. What would they be built on? A background that no longer exists. The universe does not appear to be made of pieces arranged in a container. It appears to be a self-consistent structure, where geometry, interactions, and constraints are inseparable. This is where people often reach for the word energy, hoping it will serve as the ultimate substance. Everything is energy, they say. Matter is just frozen energy. That sounds satisfying. It is also incomplete. Energy is not a thing either. It is a number, a conserved quantity associated with symmetries. You don't find energy sitting somewhere, you calculate it. It tells you what can change and what cannot. Once again, reality slips away from the idea of stuff. So what is the universe actually made of? Not particles, not fields, not space, not time. It is made of relationships that obey rules. The deeper physics goes, the more this answer repeats. Reality is not built out of ingredients the way a wall is built out of bricks. It is built out of constraints that shape what can happen. This is why the universe feels so resistant to being pictured. Every picture assumes a background and objects inside it. Physics keeps removing the background and dissolving the objects. What remains is structure. And that structure is not something you can point to. It is something you discover by asking what must be true for experiments to keep working. From inside that structure, you experience a world of objects, moments, and locations. That experience is real. It is not fundamental. The mistake was thinking experience revealed the building blocks. The truth is harsher and simpler. The universe is not made of things. Things are made of the universe. If the universe isn't made of things, then the instinct to ask, "What's underneath?" starts to fail. Underneath implies layers, foundations, a bottom floor where reality finally becomes solid. Physics has been drilling downward for centuries, and every time it thought it reached bedrock, the ground gave way again. Not because we were unlucky, because bedrock was never there. What physics keeps uncovering is not smaller pieces, but deeper rules. Constraints that don't describe what exists, so much as what is allowed. Symmetries that don't tell you what happens, but what cannot change, no matter how you look. This is why conservation laws are so central. Conservation of energy, momentum, charge. These are not substances being preserved. They are bookkeeping rules, enforced by symmetry. Energy exists because time behaves the same tomorrow as it does today. Momentum exists because space behaves the same here as it does over there. Let that sink in. What you thought were ingredients turn out to be consequences. Energy is not a thing reality is made of. It is what you get when the laws don't change over time. Momentum is not a thing flying through space. It is what you get when the laws don't care about location. Reality is built out of invariance. This is almost the opposite of how you were taught to think. You were taught that the universe is made of stuff, and laws describe how that stuff behaves. Physics keeps telling you the laws come first. The stuff is what stable behavior looks like. Now consider how strange this makes the idea of existence. If particles are patterns, fields are rules, and energy is a number, then what exactly exists? What exists are consistent possibilities. A particle exists because certain interactions are allowed and others are forbidden. A field exists because it constrains outcomes everywhere in space-time. A law exists because it holds no matter how you change perspective. Existence, at the deepest level, physics is not about occupancy. It is about permission. This is why modern physics often sounds abstract. It's not avoiding reality. It's describing the only part of reality that doesn't dissolve when you change the description. Every time you change coordinates, the math rearranges itself. What stays the same are the invariants. Those invariants are what physics calls real. Reality is what cannot be transformed away. Now bring this back to space and time, because they were supposed to be the ultimate background, the arena where the building blocks sit. But space and time refuse that role. Space expands. Time stretches. Geometry responds. There is no fixed stage. The arena itself participates. This is why asking, "What is space made of?" or "What is time made of?" is a dead end. They are not made of anything. They are part of the structure that defines what made of even means. You don't ask what a rule is made of. You ask what it does octan, and what space and time do is relate events. Once you accept that, the universe stops looking like a construction project and starts looking like a logical system. Not logical in the sense of human reasoning, but in the sense of consistency under transformation. This is where Feynman's way of thinking becomes essential. He had no patience for answers that replaced ignorance with familiar words. He wanted to know what changes when you change the conditions, and what stays the same when you look from somewhere else. That attitude leads you to a very different picture of reality. Reality is not built from the bottom up. Key, it is constrained from the top down. The laws don't emerge from particles. Particles emerge from the laws. The rules define which patterns are stable enough to look like things. This is why different building blocks appear at different scales. At one scale, atoms look fundamental. At another, quarks do. At another, fields. None of them are ultimate. They are effective descriptions that work within a range. Physics does not promise you a final ingredient. It promises you a framework that doesn't contradict itself. And now the question subtly flips. Instead of asking what reality is made of, you start asking why certain structures exist at all. Why these symmetries and not others? Why these laws and not different ones? Physics does not fully answer that, but notice what it doesn't do. It does not answer by pointing to a substance. It answers by pointing to consistency, stability, and mathematical necessity. Some structures can exist without contradiction. Others can't. The universe appears to be one of the ones that can. From inside it, you experience a world of objects, forces, moments, and motion. From the perspective of the structure, those are emergent features. They are how the constraints manifest when viewed locally and sequentially. This is why the everyday world feels solid and immediate. If reality is made of constraints rather than ingredients, then the way you experience the world starts to look less like a window and more like an interface. Not a fake one, a practical one, something that hides complexity in order to function. You don't experience symmetries. You don't experience invariance. You don't experience conservation laws. You experience objects, motion, effort, resistance, change. Those experiences are not lies. They are summaries. Your brain evolved to compress an unfathomably complex structure into something navigable. It groups stable patterns together and calls them things. It orders sequences of events and calls that time passing. It assumes a background and calls it space. None of that is fundamental. All of it is useful. Physics is what happens when you stop trusting the compression. This is why the deeper picture always feels less intuitive. It is not designed for survival. It is designed for consistency. At the level of everyday life, reality feels like it is made of stuff. At the level of physics, that stuff dissolves into behavior. And at the deepest level we can currently reach, behavior dissolves into constraints. The universe is not built the way a machine is built. There are no parts laid out on a table before assembly. There is no blueprint that lists components. There is only a set of rules that allows certain patterns to persist. Those patterns are what you call matter. Now consider how radically this changes the meaning of existence. If nothing exists as a standalone thing, then existence is not about isolation. It is about participation. An electron exists because it participates in electromagnetic interactions. A field exists because it constrains outcomes everywhere. A law exists because it holds under every allowed transformation. Existence is not a property something has by itself. It is something inferred from what cannot be removed without breaking the structure. This is why physics keeps returning to the same test, over and over. If you remove this, do the predictions still work? If the answer is no, it is real. If the answer is yes, it was decoration. Reality is what survives. Subtraction. That criterion is brutal, and it leaves almost nothing familiar standing. Objects don't survive. Absolute space doesn't survive. Absolute time doesn't survive. Even causation, as you intuitively imagine it, doesn't survive without being redefined in terms of constraints and allowed influence. What does survive is structure. This is the point where people often ask whether this means reality is just math. That question misses the mark. Mathematics is not what reality is made of. Mathematics is how you describe structure without smuggling in pictures. The universe does not run on equations. The equations run because the universe has structure. They are mirrors, not engines. But they are the only mirrors that don't distort. This is why every serious attempt to describe the building blocks of the universe eventually stops talking about blocks. It starts talking about symmetries, groups, manifolds, invariants. Language that feels abstract because it refuses to pretend that reality is built out of familiar things. And now, finally, the deepest discomfort appears. The realization that the question, what makes up our reality, was always framed the wrong way. Reality is not made up of parts. It is held together by consistency. That consistency is not imposed from outside. There is no rulebook sitting beyond the universe. The rules are the universe, in the only sense that matters. From inside that consistency, complex systems emerge. Chemistry, biology, consciousness, meaning. None of those are illusions. They are real patterns that exist because the constraints allow them to. You are one of those patterns. Your body is not made of ultimate stuff. It is made of stable interactions. Your thoughts are not floating outside physics. They are physical processes unfolding under the same rules. Your sense of self is not a thing. It is a pattern that persists because the structure allows it to. Understanding this does not flatten life. It deepens it. You stop asking what reality owes you and start noticing what it allows. The universe does not exist to be understood intuitively. It exists to be consistent. The fact that it can be understood at all is the miracle. You were taught to imagine the building blocks of the universe as tiny objects. Physics shows you something far stranger and far more powerful. The building blocks are not pieces. They are permissions. They are prohibitions. They are symmetries that refuse to break. Everything you see is what those rules look like when they are obeyed. Once you accept that, the search for the ultimate stuff ends, not in disappointment, but in clarity. There was never going to be a final ingredient you could point to. There was only ever going to be a structure that holds, and that structure is reality. Not because it feels solid, not because it looks familiar, but because it cannot be otherwise. Without contradiction. At the end of all this, the temptation is to feel disappointed, to think that if reality isn't made of tangible building blocks, then something has been taken away. No ultimate particle to point to. No final layer where everything suddenly makes sense in familiar terms. That disappointment comes from expecting reality to be simple, in the way human tools are simple. Reality was never obligated to do that. What physics keeps uncovering is not a lack of foundation, but a different kind of foundation than the one you were trained to look for. Not pieces, but principles. Not substances, but structures that cannot be violated. The universe is not held together by glue. It is held together by consistency. That is why every attempt to reduce reality to what it's made of eventually collapses. Made of implies assembly. Assembly implies parts. Parts imply independence. Physics keeps telling you that independence is the illusion. Nothing fundamental exists in isolation. Every candidate for a building block only exists because of how it relates to everything else. Remove the relationships, and the thing disappears. Not because it was fragile, but because it was never standalone to begin with. This is the hardest idea to accept, because it runs against the deepest habit of thought you have. You were taught to believe that explanation means finding smaller pieces. Physics teaches you that explanation often means finding deeper constraints. The universe is not constructed from the bottom up. It is stabilized from the inside out. Now look back at how this reframes everything you experience. Objects feel solid because the patterns that define them are extraordinarily stable. Space feels continuous because geometry changes smoothly at your scale. Time feels like it flows because your access to information is sequential and asymmetric. None of those experiences are mistakes. They are the surface appearance of a much deeper order. The building blocks of reality are not hidden underneath experience. They are what makes experience possible. Once you see that, The question, what makes up our reality, stops demanding a material answer and starts accepting a structural one. Reality is made of what cannot change when you change perspective. It is made of what cannot be removed without breaking consistency. It is made of what all observers must agree on, even when they disagree about everything else. That is why physics keeps returning to invariance, why it keeps privileging symmetry, why it keeps stripping away anything that depends on a particular viewpoint. Reality is what remains after that stripping is done. This does not mean the everyday world is fake. It means it is emergent. Emergence is not illusion. It is the appearance of stable patterns when constraints allow complexity to build. A wave is not an illusion because it is made of water molecules. A hurricane is not an illusion because it is made of air. A thought is not an illusion because it is made of neurons. These things are real because the patterns persist. Reality is layered, but not in the way you were taught. The layers are not stacked substances. They are levels of description that become useful at different scales. At one scale, particles are useful. At another, fields. At another, chemistry. At another, biology. At another, minds. None of these replace the others. None of them are ultimate. They are all real, in the only sense that matters. They work. The deepest truth hiding underneath all of this is almost anticlimactic. The universe is not made of stuff. It is made of behavior that cannot contradict itself. Everything else is what that behavior looks like when viewed from inside. Once you accept that, you stop searching for a final ingredient and start recognizing a non-final constraint. The universe is what it is because anything else would not hold together. Physics does not tell you why this particular structure exists instead of another.